December 22nd, 1941, 7:30 in the morning. A narrow dirt road north of Damortis, Luzon, Philippine Islands. Second Lieutenant Ben Morin sat in the commander's cupola of his M3 Stuart light tank, watching the jungle tree line through early morning mist. His tank, one of 5 from B Company, 192nd Tank Battalion, had arrived in Manila aboard the USS President Coolidge just 3 weeks earlier. The tanks still smelled of factory paint and cosmoline preservative grease. Morin's crew had been in the Philippines for exactly 15 days when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Now they were retreating south toward Bataan, part of a defensive screen covering the withdrawal of General MacArthur's forces. The road ahead curved through coconut groves and rice paddies. Intelligence reported Japanese armor approaching from the north. At 7:45, Morin spotted movement. 5 Japanese tanks emerged from the tree line, advancing in column formation. Type 95 Hargo light tanks, smaller than the Stuart. Lower profile. Through his binoculars, Morin could see their distinctive bell crank suspension and the stubby 37mm gun mounted in each turret. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The two forces were evenly matched on paper. Both sides fielded 37mm main guns. Both tanks carried crews of 3 or 4 men. Both were classified as light tanks, designed for reconnaissance and infantry support rather than tank versus tank combat. But there existed between these machines a fundamental difference that neither side yet understood. A technical asymmetry that would reveal itself in the next 20 minutes. The Japanese tanks moved with confidence. Their crews had combat experience from 5 years of war in China. They had faced Chinese tanks and won. They had supported in infantry attacks across difficult terrain. They understood their equipment and trusted their tactics. The Type 95 had proven itself reliable and effective. Its diesel engine rarely broke down. Its suspension handled rough ground well. Its gun, though modest in size, could penetrate light armor at reasonable range. The American crews, by contrast, were utterly inexperienced. Most had never fired their main guns in combat. They had practiced gunnery at Fort Knox, Kentucky, shooting at stationary targets on flat ranges. They understood the mechanics of their tanks but possessed no battlefield wisdom. Everything they knew came from training manuals and peacetime drills. Yet their tanks carried something the Japanese did not know existed. Something the American tankers themselves barely understood how to use properly. A gyroscopic stabilization system for the 37mm gun. A Westinghouse-designed mechanism that kept the main gun aligned on target while the tank moved over rough terrain. The first such system ever installed in an operational American tank. The M3A1 variant, which would incorporate this stabilizer as standard equipment, would not enter production until May 1942. But earlier, M3 models had been retrofitted with experimental stabilizers during final assembly. Morin's tank was one of them. His gunner, Sergeant William Patterson, had received exactly 4 hours of instruction on the stabilizer's operation before they shipped overseas. The manual warned that the system required careful maintenance and skilled operation. Most crews, lacking proper training, simply turned the stabilizer off. The Japanese tanks accelerated, closing the distance. Their commanders had spotted the American tanks and were moving to engage. This would be the first tank versus tank engagement between American and Japanese forces in World War II. Neither side yet understood what they were about to learn. To understand what happened on that road, north of Damortis, requires understanding what the Imperial Japanese Army believed about armored warfare in 1941, and why those beliefs seemed entirely reasonable given their experience. Japanese tank doctrine had evolved through a decade of combat in China, and brief but intense fighting against Soviet forces at Khalkhin Gol in 1939. The Type 95 Hargo represented the distillation of that experience. Designed in 1933 and entering production in 1936, the Hargo embodied specific tactical principles that the Japanese Army considered proven and effective. The tank weighed 7.4 tons. Its Mitsubishi 6-cylinder diesel engine produced 120 horsepower, giving it a road speed of 28 miles per hour and cross-country speed of 16 miles per hour. This mobility was intentional. Japanese doctrine emphasized rapid movement and exploitation of breakthrough, rather than slugging matches with enemy armor. The Hago was built to keep pace with motorized infantry, to scout ahead of main forces, to exploit gaps in enemy lines. Its armor ranged from 6 mm to 12 mm in thickness, thin by European standards, but adequate against the Chinese forces Japan had been fighting since 1937. Chinese armor barely existed. Their anti-tank weapons consisted primarily of German-supplied 37 mm guns, effective only at close range. The Hago's armor could defeat rifle-caliber bullets and shell fragments that had proven sufficient. The main armament was a Type 94 37 mm tank gun with a barrel length of 46.1 calibers. It fired two types of ammunition: high-explosive shells for use against infantry and soft targets, armor-piercing shells with a muzzle velocity of 580 meters per second, capable of penetrating 36 mm of armor at 275 meters range. Against enemy's tanks and fortifications, this firepower had proven adequate. But the Hago suffered from a critical design limitation that Japanese tankers had learned to work around through training and tactics. The turret was cramped. Only the commander occupied it. He served as both commander and gunner, responsible for observation, target acquisition, gun loading, aiming, firing, and tactical decision-making. This placed an enormous cognitive burden on one man. The turret traversed manually, requiring physical effort to rotate. It could turn only 45 degrees in either direction before the commander had to reposition the entire tank. Secondary armament consisted of two 7.7 mm Type 97 machine guns, one mounted in the rear of the turret, facing backward and to the right, one mounted in the hull front, operated by the bow gunner. These weapons protected the tank against infantry assault, a constant threat in Chinese combat operations where enemy soldiers armed with magnetic mines and explosive charges attempted to swarm Japanese tanks at close range. The Japanese crews approaching Morin's position that morning in December 1941 believed they understood tank combat. They had fought in it. They had survived it. They knew that victory came through superior positioning, through seeing the enemy first, through bringing guns to bear quickly and firing accurately. They knew that in tank versus tank combat, the side that fired first and hit first usually won. Their doctrine emphasized aggressive action. Japanese military culture valued offensive spirit, the concept of attacking ruthlessly, of seizing initiative, of forcing the enemy to react rather than act. This philosophy had served Japan well in China, where surprise and aggression often compensated for limited numbers and modest equipment. The Hago crews had trained extensively. Japanese tankers underwent rigorous preparation. They practiced gunnery until they could estimate range accurately and engage targets rapidly. They drilled on movement formations, on communication procedures, on how to support infantry operations. Their training emphasized teamwork within the crew and coordination between tanks. Against Chinese forces, these tactics had proven devastatingly effective. Chinese tanks, when encountered at all, were generally obsolete models purchased from foreign suppliers. Soviet-made 26s, British Vickers models, German light tanks, none presented serious threats to well-handled Japanese armor. The Hago's superior reliability and crew training usually decided engagements before firepower became the determining factor. Even against Soviet forces at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where the Japanese faced more capable BT-5 and BT-7 fast tanks, armed with 45 mm guns, Japanese tankers had learned that careful tactics could overcome material disadvantage. The Soviet tanks had longer-range guns and heavier armor, but Japanese crews discovered that aggressive maneuvering, good use of terrain, and combined arms coordination with infantry and artillery could achieve tactical success. The Americans possessed a technical advantage so novel that most of their own tankers did not fully understand it. The gyroscopic gun stabilizer represented a fundamental leap in fire control technology, but its significance would not become apparent until crews learned to employ it properly under combat conditions. The Westinghouse Company had begun development of tank gun stabilization systems in the mid-1930s, building on naval fire control technology. Warships had employed gyroscopic stabilization for years, keeping guns aligned on distant targets despite the rolling motion of vessels at sea. Adapting this technology for tanks presented unique challenges. Tanks moved over rougher terrain than ships moved through waves. They pitched and rolled more violently. They accelerated and decelerated more rapidly. The system installed in the M3 Stuart stabilized the gun in the vertical plane only. It did not stabilize turret traverse. A gyroscope mounted near the gun measured the vertical angle of the barrel when the tank moved over uneven ground, causing the hull to pitch forward or backward. The gyroscope detected the change and sent electrical signals to a hydraulic system that adjusted the gun's elevation to compensate. The process occurred continuously, many times per second, keeping the gun aligned on the target's vertical position regardless of hull movement. This capability transformed the fundamental dynamics of moving tank gunnery. In a tank without stabilization, firing accurately while moving was nearly impossible. As the vehicle traversed rough ground, the hull pitched and rolled. The gun, rigidly mounted to the turret, pitched and rolled with it. The gunner, peering through his sight, watched the reticle bounce wildly across the target. He could not maintain aim. Firing while moving meant firing blind, hoping the gun happened to be aligned at the instant the round left the barrel. Standard doctrine therefore required tanks to stop before engaging targets. The driver would halt the vehicle. The gunner would reacquire the target through his sight. He would refine his aim. Then he would fire. After firing, the tank might move to a new position before the enemy could return fire. But the actual engagement required a stationary firing platform. The stabilizer changed this equation. With the system activated, the gun remained aligned on target while the tank moved, not perfectly aligned. The technology of 1941 could not achieve perfection, but aligned well enough that a skilled gunner could maintain a firing solution while moving at speeds up to 10 miles per hour over moderately rough terrain. This meant American tanks could engage targets without stopping. They could advance while firing. They could retreat while firing. They possessed the capability to shoot and maneuver simultaneously. However, realizing this capability required proper training and technique. The gunner needed to learn to trust the stabilizer rather than fighting against it. He needed to understand that the gyroscope would keep the gun aligned if he allowed it to work. Many gunners, trained on unstabilized tanks, instinctively tried to correct for vehicle motion by manipulating the gun controls. This interference defeated the stabilizer's purpose. The system worked best when the gunner acquired the target, centered it in his sight, and then held the firing control steady, allowing the gyroscope to compensate for vehicle movement. The stabilizer also required maintenance. Its hydraulic system needed proper fluid levels and pressure. Its electrical connections had to remain clean and secure. Its gyroscope had to be properly calibrated. In the field, under combat conditions, with limited technical support, many stabilizer systems failed or were deliberately disconnected by crews who did not trust them or did not understand their operation. American tank crews arriving in the Philippines in November 1941 had received minimal instruction on stabilizer employment. The technology was too new. Training doctrine had not caught up with equipment capability. Most gunners knew the stabilizer existed, but had practiced with it only briefly. Many officers questioned whether the added complexity justified whatever tactical advantage the system might provide. The Japanese, meanwhile, had no knowledge that such technology existed. Their intelligence services had not identified gun stabilization as a feature of American tanks. Japanese technical manuals for the M3 Stuart, compiled from photographs and captured documents, made no mention of any stabilization system. Japanese tank designers had not pursued similar technology. The concept of firing accurately while moving seemed impractical given the mechanical limitations of the era. This asymmetry of knowledge would prove decisive. The Japanese approached the engagement near Damortis with tactics developed for tanks that had to stop to fire accurately. The Americans possessed equipment that could maintain fire while maneuvering, though most barely understood how to employ this capability. What happened next would teach both sides lessons they had not anticipated. Second Lieutenant Benjamin Morin came from Maywood, Illinois, 23 years old, B Company, 192nd Tank Battalion, Illinois National Guard. He had joined the local Guard Tank Company in 1938, attracted by the steady paycheck during Depression years and the mechanical work that suited his aptitude. The federalization of his unit in November 1940 transformed him from weekend warrior to full-time soldier. The 192nd Tank Battalion assembled at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in late November 1940. 4 companies drawn from 4 different states, a company from Janesville, Wisconsin, B Company from Maywood, Illinois, C Company from Port Clinton, Ohio, D Company from Harrodsburg, Kentucky, men who had trained separately in their home states, operating older equipment, suddenly found themselves together as a battalion, equipped with the newest American tanks rolling off assembly lines. Training at Fort Knox lasted through the winter and spring of 1941. The crews learned basic tank operation, how to drive the M3 over rough terrain, how to maintain the Continental radial engine, how to service the suspension, how to perform track maintenance. They practiced gunnery on ranges, firing at stationary targets. They conducted formation drills, learning to maneuver as platoons and companies, standard training for an independent tank battalion. But the M3 Stuart was so new that proper training doctrine did not yet exist. Technical manuals arrived incomplete. Maintenance procedures were still being developed. The Gyroscopic Stabilizer system, retrofitted onto some tanks during final assembly, received minimal attention during training. Most instructors at Fort Knox had never seen the system before. They could explain its theoretical function but possessed no practical experience in its employment. Sergeant William Patterson, gunner in Morin's tank, received approximately 4 hours of instruction on stabilizer operation. The training emphasized that the system was delicate, that it required careful maintenance, that improper use could damage the hydraulics. Instructors warned that the stabilizer worked only at speeds below 10 miles per hour on moderately smooth terrain. They explained that the gunner needed to trust the gyroscope, to stop trying to manually correct for vehicle motion, to let the mechanism do its work. But 4 hours of instruction could not overcome years of training on unstabilized guns. Patterson had learned gunnery the traditional way. Stop the tank, acquire the target, refine the aim, fire, move to a new position. His muscle memory, his instincts, all reinforced that sequence. The stabilizer required a different approach, a different mindset. Trust the machine, fire while moving. It felt wrong to experienced tank crews. The battalion participated in the Louisiana maneuvers in September 1941. Large-scale exercises involving tens of thousands of troops. The tankers practiced supporting infantry attacks, conducting reconnaissance, screening withdrawals. They learned combined arms tactics. They discovered that tanks without infantry support were vulnerable. They experienced the confusion of battlefield communications. They learned lessons that peacetime garrison training could never teach. On a hillside at Camp Polk, Louisiana, after the maneuvers concluded, the battalion received orders. They were deploying overseas. Destination classified. Those 29 years or older received the option to resign from federal service. Their 1-year commitment was nearly complete. Many took the discharge. Replacements arrived from the 753rd Tank Battalion at Fort Benning, Georgia. Young men who had even less training than the original Guard members. The battalion was being sent into unknown circumstances with partially trained crews operating equipment they barely understood. The companies traveled west by different rail routes. They converged at San Francisco in October 1941. They boarded ships. The USS President Coolidge carried Morin's B Company. The convoy sailed west across the Pacific. Only after departure did the men learn their destination. Manila, Philippine Islands. They would reinforce General MacArthur's command, providing armored capability to forces defending America's largest Pacific possession. The 192nd Tank Battalion arrived at Manila on November 20, 1941. 54 M3 Stuart tanks, 23 half-tracks, support vehicles, They moved to Fort Stotzenberg near Clark Field, northwest of Manila. They had 17 days before war began. 17 days to acclimate to tropical heat and humidity. 17 days to establish maintenance procedures in field conditions. 17 days to prepare for combat against an enemy whose capabilities they did not understand. The battalion possessed the most modern American tanks available in late 1941, better armored than Japanese light tanks, mechanically reliable, well-designed suspension, adequate firepower for their role. But they were light tanks, intended for reconnaissance and infantry support, not for slugging matches with enemy armor. Their 37mm guns could defeat light armor at reasonable range but lacked the punch to engage heavier vehicles or fortified positions effectively. More critically, the crews lacked combat experience. They had never been shot at. They had never fired at moving targets that fired back. They had never operated under the stress of actual combat. They had never tested whether their brief training on the stabilizer system would prove useful, or whether the technology would fail under battlefield conditions. They were about to learn these things very quickly. 7:45 on the morning of December 22, 1941. Morin spotted the Japanese tanks emerging from the tree line, 5 Type 95 Hago light tanks, advancing in column formation down the dirt road toward Damortis. Behind them, the sound of more vehicles, infantry, support elements, an entire mechanized force moving south toward Manila. Morin's platoon consisted of 5 M3 Stuarts, his own command tank, Sergeant Al Edwards' tank, Sergeant Willard von Bergen's tank, Sergeant Larry Jordan's tank, Sergeant Ray Vandenbroek's tank, 5 tanks low on fuel after driving through the night, 5 crews exhausted from days of retreat, 5 groups of men about to fight America's first tank versus tank engagement of World War II. The Japanese tanks accelerated when they spotted the Americans. Their commanders understood the tactical principle. Close the range quickly, bring guns to bear, strike first. The Hago crews had trained for this. They knew their equipment. They trusted their doctrine. Attack aggressively, seize initiative, force the enemy to react. Morin ordered his tank off the road. Standard American doctrine. When engaging enemy armor, maneuver to present a smaller target. Get off the predictable avenue of approach. Find covered positions. His driver turned hard left, the Stuart's tracks biting into soft ground beside the road. The Japanese lead tank fired. The 37mm gun cracked. The armor-piercing round crossed the distance in less than a second. It struck Morin's Stuart on the hull side. The 12mm armor plate of the Hago's projectile could not penetrate the Stuart's heavier armor everywhere, but at close range, at the right angle, against certain spots on the hull, it could achieve penetration. The round punched through. Inside the Stuart, the impact was catastrophic. Metal fragments ricocheted through the fighting compartment. The engine caught fire, fuel lines ruptured. Within seconds, the interior filled with smoke and flames. Morin's crew had perhaps 30 seconds before the tank became an inferno. Morin took shrapnel in his shoulder, pain and shock. His driver, his gunner, his loader, all shouting, smoke obscuring vision, fire spreading. The tank was finished. Morin had one choice: get his crew out before they burned alive. He ordered evacuation. The crew bailed out through hatches. They emerged into small arms fire from Japanese infantry who had moved up with the tanks. The 4 remaining American tanks engaged. Their gunners acquired targets. They fired. Some rounds hit, some missed. The Japanese tanks maneuvered aggressively, presenting difficult targets. Their commanders showed no hesitation. They had done this before in China. They knew how to press an attack. But something was different. The American tanks did not stop to fire. They continued moving while engaging targets. Their guns remained aligned on the Japanese tanks even as the Stuarts traversed rough ground. The gyroscopic stabilizers were functioning. The gunners, despite minimal training, were learning to trust the system in the most brutal classroom possible. Staff Sergeant Al Edwards' gunner fired while Edwards' tank moved at approximately 8 miles per hour over uneven terrain. The stabilizer kept the 37mm gun aligned on a Hago, attempting to flank the American position. The round struck the Japanese tank's turret. The thin armor could not resist. The armor-piercing projectile penetrated into the fighting compartment. The Hago stopped moving. This should not have been possible. In tank combat, as Japanese crews understood it, accurate fire required a stationary firing platform. Moving tanks could not hit targets reliably. Yet, the American tanks were hitting while moving. The Japanese had no explanation for this. Their intelligence had not prepared them for stabilized guns. Their doctrine had no counter-tactics for tanks that could shoot accurately while maneuvering. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes. The Japanese had numerical superiority when infantry support and follow-on tanks were considered. But the 4 remaining American tanks had demonstrated capability the Japanese did not expect. They withdrew in relatively good order, having disabled Morin's tank and inflicted casualties on his crew. Japanese aircraft arrived within an hour. Zero fighters strafed the retreating American tanks. Without air cover, without prepared defensive positions, the Stuart crews faced attacks from above. The 4 tanks that had survived the ground engagement were all disabled or destroyed by air attack before the day ended. Morin and his crew, wounded and separated from their disabled tank, were captured by Japanese infantry. The engagement proved several things. First, that American and Japanese light tanks were roughly equivalent in armament and armor. Second, that crew experience and tactical doctrine mattered as much as equipment quality. Third, that technologies the enemy did not know existed could provide decisive advantages even when employed by inexperienced crews. And fourth, that air superiority trumped ground tactical advantages. The Japanese controlled the sky over the Philippines in December 1941. That fact would matter more than any technical feature of American tanks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engagement north of Damortis revealed to both sides truths they had not anticipated. For the Americans, the harsh reality that technical advantages meant little without proper training, tactical doctrine, and combined arms support. For the Japanese, the uncomfortable discovery that their opponents possessed capabilities Japanese intelligence had failed to identify. Japanese after-action reports from the 4th Tank Regiment noted with confusion that American tanks had fired accurately while moving. This contradicted Japanese understanding of tank gunnery. Their technical intelligence officers examined captured M3 Stuarts. They discovered the gyroscopic stabilizer system. They studied its construction. They attempted to understand its function. Japanese tank designers had not pursued similar technology. The concept seemed impractical given the mechanical limitations they worked within. The stabilizer represented American industrial and technical capability. The United States possessed the manufacturing precision to build gyroscopes reliable enough for combat use. They had the electrical components necessary for the control system. They had the hydraulic technology to implement the gun adjustments rapidly enough to compensate for vehicle motion. Japanese industry in 1941 could not replicate these capabilities even if designers had wanted to. But the stabilizer's existence mattered less than whether crews could employ it effectively. The engagement at Damortis demonstrated that even minimally trained American crews could use the system under combat conditions. However, the Japanese also learned that technological advantages could be neutralized by other factors: superior tactics, better training, numerical superiority, and especially air supremacy, could overcome technical edges in individual weapons systems. Over the following weeks, as American and Filipino forces withdrew into the Bataan Peninsula, the 192nd Tank Battalion fought multiple engagements against Japanese armor. At WWII on December 31st, C Company's tanks encountered Japanese medium and light tanks in an urban environment. The Americans, using better tactics and operating with artillery support, destroyed a company of Japanese tanks while suffering minimal losses themselves. The stabilizer played a role, allowing American tanks to engage while moving through narrow streets, but coordination with artillery and infantry proved more decisive than any single technical feature. Japanese tankers adapted. They learned to respect American tanks' ability to fire while moving. They adjusted tactics accordingly. They used terrain more carefully. They coordinated with anti-tank guns and infantry. They continued to exploit their air superiority, using aircraft to attack American tanks when ground engagement proved costly. The irony was that the stabilizer, this technological marvel that American engineers had developed and American industry had produced, saw limited use in the Philippines campaign. Most M3 Stuart crews eventually turned the system off. It required maintenance they could not provide in jungle conditions. It failed under the stress of constant combat operations. Crews reverted to traditional gunnery methods, stopping to fire, because that approach felt more reliable even if it was tactically less advantageous. The larger lesson was strategic rather than tactical. Japan had attacked the United States believing that American forces in the Pacific could be defeated quickly, that American will to fight could be broken, that a negotiated peace could be achieved before American industrial might fully mobilized. The quality of American equipment surprised Japanese forces. The M3 Stuart, despite its limitations, was better than Japanese intelligence had suggested. Its stabilizer represented technical capabilities Japan could not match, but equipment quality alone would not decide the Pacific War. The 192nd Tank Battalion, despite possessing excellent tanks, ceased to exist as a combat unit when Bataan fell on April 9, 1942. Of the 593 officers and men who had deployed to the Philippines in October 1941, 328 would die in combat during the Bataan Death March or in Japanese prisoner of war camps. Lieutenant Morin, captured on December 22, survived captivity and later became a Roman Catholic priest. The stabilizer existed. It worked. Under ideal conditions with properly trained crews and adequate maintenance, it provided a real tactical advantage. But wars are not fought under ideal conditions. Technology matters, training matters, doctrine matters, industrial capacity matters, air superiority matters. Strategic position matters. The side that gets more of these factors right and sustains them longer wins. Japan got some of these factors right in December 1941. America would eventually get all of them right. That difference would decide the war. The Type 95 Hargo crews who fought at Damortis had no way to know this. They saw American tanks that could fire while moving. They adapted their tactics. They continued fighting. They won most engagements in the Philippines through superior numbers, better coordination, and total air supremacy. The war seemed to be going as planned. Japan's southern advance proceeded ahead of schedule. The empire expanded rapidly. Victory seemed assured, but American industry was mobilizing. By 1943, American factories would be producing thousands of tanks monthly. American shipyards would be launching aircraft carriers at a rate Japan could not begin to match. American training programs would be generating crews who understood how to use their equipment properly. The technological advantages that surprised Japanese forces at Damortis in December 1941 were merely previews of the overwhelming material superiority America would bring to bear by war's end. The gyroscopic stabilizer in the M3 Stuart was significant not because it won battles by itself, but because it represented what Japan was fighting against: an industrial economy that could afford to put expensive, complex technology into thousands of light tanks. An engineering establishment that solved problems Japanese engineers had not even attempted. A military that could field experimental systems in frontline equipment, even when crews barely understood how to use them properly. These were symptoms of a fundamental imbalance that no amount of fighting spirit or tactical skill could overcome in the long run. Lieutenant Morin, wounded and captured after 20 minutes of combat, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He did not see how the conflict developed. He did not witness the eventual American victory. He simply endured captivity, survived somehow, and returned home when the war ended. The technological advantage his tank possessed that December morning mattered in that one engagement. It demonstrated to Japanese forces that their opponents had capabilities worth respecting. But it did not change the outcome of that particular fight, or the Philippines campaign, or anything immediate. Technology alone never does. It simply shifts probabilities slightly in one direction. Compound those slight shifts over thousands of engagements, and eventually they determine outcomes. But individual soldiers rarely see that larger pattern. They see only the fight in front of them. The engagement north of Damortis on December 22, 1941 lasted approximately 20 minutes. Its immediate consequences extended far beyond those 20 minutes. Lieutenant Morin and his crew, wounded and separated from their burning tank, became prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army. They spent the next 3 years and 4 months in captivity. Morin survived. Many of his fellow tankers did not. The 192nd Tank Battalion continued fighting as American and Filipino forces withdrew into the Bataan Peninsula. They fought delaying actions at multiple positions. At Plaridel, the tankers held a river crossing for 3 days when they had been asked to hold for 6 hours, allowing Southern forces to withdraw safely. They engaged Japanese tanks again at WWII on December 31st, where C Company destroyed an entire company of Japanese armor while suffering minimal losses themselves. The stabilizer played its role in these engagements, but combined arms tactics and better positioning proved more decisive than any single technical feature. By January 1942, the battalion's tanks were wearing out. Maintenance became increasingly difficult. Spare parts did not exist. The gyroscopic stabilizers, complex and sensitive, failed under combat stress and tropical conditions. Crews who had briefly learned to trust the system watched it break down. They returned to traditional gunnery methods: stop, aim, fire, move. The technology that had surprised Japanese tankers at Damortis became irrelevant as mechanical failures rendered it inoperable. Fuel shortages crippled operations more than enemy action. The M3 Stuart's Continental radial engine consumed gasoline at rates American logistics in the Philippines could not sustain. Japanese control of supply routes meant no replacements arrived. Tankers scavenged fuel from disabled vehicles. They consolidated their remaining gasoline into fewer and fewer operational tanks. By March, most of the battalion's Stuarts sat immobile, their fuel tanks empty. When Bataan fell on April 9, 1942, surviving members of the 192nd Tank Battalion became prisoners of war. Of the 593 officers and men who had deployed to the Philippines in October 1941, 328 would die before war's end. Some died in combat. Some were executed. Most died from disease, malnutrition, and abuse in Japanese prisoner of war camps. Many died in the holds of unmarked transport ships, sunk by American submarines that had no way to know they carried Allied prisoners. The Japanese captured numerous M3 Stuart tanks intact. They examined them thoroughly. Japanese technical intelligence officers studied the gyroscopic stabilizer with particular interest. They documented its construction. They tested its function. They wrote reports analyzing American tank technology. These reports confirmed what Japanese tankers had experienced at Damortis. American tanks could fire accurately while moving. The technology worked. Japan lacked the industrial capacity and technical infrastructure to replicate it. Japanese forces used some captured Stuarts against their former owners. They painted Japanese markings on American tanks and pressed them into service. The irony was profound. Japanese crews operating American tanks with stabilizers they barely understood, fighting against an industrial power that would produce replacement tanks faster than Japan could destroy them. A few captured Stuarts remained in Japanese service until war's end. When American forces liberated the Philippines in 1944 and 45, they occasionally encountered their own tanks, now bearing Japanese markings, knocked out in battles fought years after their capture. The M3A1 variant, which incorporated the stabilizer as standard equipment from production start in May 1942, became the primary light tank variant delivered to Allied forces. Over 4,600 M3A1s were manufactured before production shifted to the M5 series. The stabilizer became standard on American light tanks. British forces received M3A1s under Lend-Lease, but often found the system unreliable in desert conditions. Soviet forces, also receiving Stuarts through Lend-Lease, frequently disabled the stabilizer, considering it an unnecessary complication that required high-grade fuel and skilled maintenance their logistics could not support. American crews in subsequent campaigns had mixed experiences with the stabilizer. In North Africa, dust and sand infiltrated the delicate mechanisms. In the Pacific Islands, humidity and tropical conditions accelerated corrosion. Crews who maintained the system properly and learned to use it effectively swore by its advantages. Crews who lacked proper training or maintenance support disabled it and returned to traditional methods. The technology's effectiveness depended entirely on support infrastructure and crew proficiency. Advanced equipment meant nothing without the logistics to sustain it and the training to employ it. By late 1943, American tank doctrine had evolved. Light tanks were relegated to reconnaissance and screening roles in theaters facing German armor. The 37mm gun proved inadequate against upgunned Panzer IIIs and IVs. The Stuart's thin armor could not withstand German anti-tank weapons. But in the Pacific, where Japanese tanks remained lightly armored and Japanese anti-tank weapons remained limited, the Stuart continued serving effectively in infantry support roles. The stabilizer provided advantages in jungle combat, where engagement ranges were short and targets appeared suddenly. A tank that could fire accurately while moving through dense vegetation possessed real tactical value. The technology that surprised Japanese forces in December 1941 became routine by 1943. Stabilized guns appeared on more American tanks. The M4 Sherman received improved stabilization systems. British designers developed two-plane stabilizers that controlled both elevation and traverse. Soviet designers studied captured German tanks and Allied equipment, developing their own stabilization systems. The arms race in fire control technology accelerated. What had been cutting-edge innovation in 1941 became standard equipment by 1943 and obsolete by 1945. Lieutenant Morin survived captivity. He endured the Bataan Death March. He survived disease and starvation in prisoner of war camps. He witnessed atrocities. He watched comrades die. When liberation came in September 1945, Morin weighed 90 pounds. He had entered the Philippines at 160. The war had consumed more than his physical health. It had taken 3 years and 4 months of his life. It had killed most of the men he had commanded and served alongside. After the war, Benjamin Morin chose a path that surprised those who knew him. He entered seminary. He studied for the priesthood. In 1946, he was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest. He spent 38 years as a missionary in Peru, serving remote communities in the Andes Mountains. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked about his experiences, he would acknowledge that he had served, that he had been captured, that he had survived. He did not elaborate. The memories were too painful. Morin lived until 2016. He died at age 94, the last surviving officer of the 192nd Tank Battalion. In his final years, he occasionally granted interviews to historians researching the Philippines campaign. He described the engagement at Damortis in factual terms. He explained what happened. He did not claim heroism. He insisted he had simply done his duty. The tank had been hit, the crew had evacuated, they had been captured. That was all. The larger significance of that engagement, the technical revelations it produced, the historical questions it raised, these things seemed unimportant to a man who had spent decades trying to make peace with what he had witnessed. The gyroscopic stabilizer technology that Morin's tank carried into combat in December 1941 evolved throughout the war and beyond. American designers developed improved systems. The M4 Sherman stabilizer was more sophisticated than the Stuart's. Post-war tanks featured even better fire control systems. By the 1960s, laser rangefinders and ballistic computers transformed tank gunnery. By the 1970s, thermal sights and advanced stabilization allowed accurate fire at high speeds over rough terrain. The technology that had been experimental in 1941 became fundamental to modern armored warfare. The M3 Stuart itself served throughout World War II and beyond. Over 22,000 were produced in all variants. They fought in every theater where American forces operated. They equipped Allied armies worldwide through Lend-Lease. After World War II ended, Surplus Stuarts went to armies in South America, Asia, and elsewhere. Some remained in service into the 1970s. Paraguay operated M3 Stuarts until 2014, making them among the longest-serving tanks in military history. Their reliability, simplicity, and adequate performance for constabulary duties kept them relevant decades after they became obsolete as frontline combat vehicles. The larger lesson the Stuart represented was about industrial capacity and technological innovation. The United States in 1941 possessed the industrial base to install experimental stabilization systems in light tanks while still ramping up production. American factories could afford to add complex, expensive technology to thousands of vehicles. American logistics could support maintaining that technology in field conditions. American training establishments could teach crews to use it, even if instruction time was limited. These capabilities reflected economic and industrial advantages Japan could not match. By 1943, American factories were producing more tanks in a single month than Japan produced during the entire war. American shipyards were launching aircraft carriers faster than Japan could train crews for the carriers they had. American pilot training programs were graduating more aviators monthly than Japan had lost at Midway. The quantitative imbalance was staggering. But it was not just quantity. American equipment was also qualitatively superior in most categories. Better radios, better fire control, better logistics, better maintenance support, better training infrastructure. The stabilizer in the M3 Stuart was one small example of a much larger pattern. American industry could afford to innovate while expanding production. Japanese industry had to choose between innovation and production. They lacked resources to do both. They built tanks that were adequate for fighting in China but obsolete against American equipment. They built aircraft that were superb at war's start but became increasingly outclassed. They could not replace losses fast enough. They could not train crews fast enough. They could not innovate fast enough. Japanese tankers who survived the war wrote memoirs describing their experiences. Several mentioned encounters with American tanks that fired while moving. They expressed surprise at this capability. They acknowledged it provided tactical advantages. But they also noted that American numerical superiority and air dominance mattered more than any technical feature of individual tanks. Japan lost the Pacific War because America possessed overwhelming material advantages compounded over time. The stabilizer was one small component of that larger imbalance. The 192nd Tank Battalion was reconstituted after World War II as a National Guard unit. It served in subsequent conflicts. Its history honored the men who fought in the Philippines. Memorials in Janesville, Wisconsin, in Maywood, Illinois, in Port Clinton, Ohio, and in Harrodsburg, Kentucky commemorate the soldiers from those communities who deployed in October 1941 and never returned. The battalion's story became part of American military heritage. The first American tankers to fight enemy tanks in World War II, the defenders of Bataan, the survivors of the Death March, the prisoners who endured years of captivity. But the technical detail about the stabilizer, the small technological advantage that had surprised Japanese forces, this aspect of the story received less attention. It was overshadowed by the larger narrative of suffering and survival. Perhaps rightly so. The human cost mattered more than the technical details. 328 men died. That number deserves remembrance more than any piece of equipment they carried. Yet the stabilizer's story remains significant for what it reveals about the nature of technological warfare. Advanced equipment provides advantages only when supported by adequate logistics, maintenance, training, and doctrine. The best technology in the world means nothing if it breaks down in field conditions and cannot be repaired. The most innovative design provides no benefit if crews do not understand how to employ it effectively. War is not decided by individual pieces of equipment but by the systematic integration of technology, training, logistics, tactics, and industrial capacity. The side that masters all these elements wins. The side that excels in only some of them loses. December 22, 1941, 7:45 in the morning. A dirt road north of Damortis. Two forces met. Both believed they understood tank combat. Both possessed reasonable equipment for 1941. Both were about to learn lessons neither anticipated. The Japanese learned that American tanks carried capabilities their intelligence had not identified. The Americans learned that technological advantages meant little against experienced crews with good tactics and overwhelming numbers. Both sides learned that the Pacific War would be decided by factors far more fundamental than individual equipment features: industrial capacity, logistics, training infrastructure, air power, naval strength, the ability to sustain operations across vast distances. These factors would matter more than whether a tank's gun was stabilized. The gyroscopic stabilizer in the M3 Stuart represented something larger than itself. It symbolized American industrial sophistication, the ability to mass-produce complex technology, the engineering capability to solve difficult problems, the economic strength to afford expensive solutions. Japan faced an opponent that could install experimental fire control systems in light tanks while simultaneously building aircraft carriers, training pilots, developing radar, breaking codes, and supplying forces across the Pacific. The scope of American capability became apparent through accumulation of details like the stabilizer. Each individual advancement seemed modest. Collectively, they demonstrated an insurmountable advantage. Lieutenant Morin spent 20 minutes in combat on December 22, 1941. Those 20 minutes defined the rest of his life. He spent 3 years and 4 months as a prisoner of war. He spent 38 years as a missionary priest. He spent nearly a century carrying memories of that morning when his tank was hit, when his crew evacuated, when he became a prisoner. The stabilizer in his tank's turret, the technological feature that had surprised Japanese tankers, meant nothing compared to the experience of survival, captivity, and the lifelong processing of trauma. The technical question of whether Japan knew about the M3 Stuart's gyroscopic stabilizer has a simple answer. They did not know before Damortis. They discovered it during combat. They studied captured tanks afterward. They documented the technology, but they lacked the industrial capacity to replicate it, and lacked the time to develop countermeasures before American material superiority overwhelmed them. Knowledge of the technology changed nothing strategically. The human question of what that engagement meant to the men who fought it has more complex answers. For Morin and his crew, it meant wounds, capture, and years of suffering. For the Japanese tankers, it meant victory in that particular fight but ultimate defeat in the larger war. For the tank crews on both sides who survived, it meant memories they would carry forever. Combat experience that would shape how they understood courage, fear, mortality, and the arbitrary nature of survival. The historical question of what the engagement revealed about the Pacific War has clearer answers. It demonstrated that equipment quality mattered but was not decisive by itself. Training mattered, tactics mattered, logistics mattered. Industrial capacity mattered most of all. The United States could afford to put stabilizers in light tanks because American industry had capacity to spare. Japan could not afford such sophistication because Japanese industry was already stretched to its limits. That fundamental imbalance would decide the war's outcome more than any single battle or any particular piece of equipment. The M3 Stuart, with its gyroscopic stabilizer, serves as a useful lens for understanding how technological warfare actually functions. Innovations provide advantages, but only when supported by adequate logistics, training, doctrine, and industrial capacity. The best equipment in the world proves useless if it breaks down and cannot be repaired. The most advanced technology provides no benefit if operators do not understand how to use it properly. Wars are won by systematic superiority across multiple domains, not by possession of individual wonder weapons. Japan learned this lesson at immense cost. The empire that attacked Pearl Harbor, believing it could force a negotiated peace, discovered instead that it faced an opponent whose industrial might could not be overcome. American factories produced 22,000 M3 Stuart tanks. They produced over 40,000 M4 Sherman medium tanks. They produced 115 aircraft carriers of all types during the war. Japan produced 25 carriers total. These numbers decided the Pacific War's outcome more certainly than any tactical engagement or technical feature ever could. The stabilizer existed, it worked, it then provided advantages. Japanese forces did not know about it initially and were surprised when they encountered it. But knowing about it would not have changed anything strategically. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to win a protracted war against the United States, regardless of what technical surprises appeared on the battlefield. The fundamental asymmetry was economic and industrial, not technological. Lieutenant Benjamin Morin, the last surviving officer of the 192nd Tank Battalion, died in 2016 at age 94. He had lived 74 years after that December morning when his tank took a hit north of Damortis. The gyroscopic stabilizer his tank carried into combat represented American industrial capability, but Morin's survival through years of captivity represented something the stabilizer never could: human endurance, the will to survive, the capacity to find meaning after trauma. These qualities matter more than any technology, in war or in peace. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. The technology that surprised Japanese forces was obsolete within 3 years. The war ended in 1945, but the men who fought, who survived, who endured, carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. That is the real cost of war, not the equipment destroyed, not the technological lessons learned, but the human price paid by those who served, and by those who did not come home. 328 men of the 192nd Tank Battalion died. Their deaths matter more than any piece of equipment they carried, no matter how innovative or surprising it might have been. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.